I'd like to welcome everyone after the break, and it is time to resume. I'm Sławomir Wacewicz, and I will have the honor of presenting our next speakers. Our next speaker is Professor Anne Russon. Professor Russon is a distinguished professor at Glendon College, York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and is a primatologist and psychologist who specializes in research on mental abilities and in particular imitation in primates, and is particularly well known in the world for her research with orangutans. Anne has published extensively both research papers in the most prestigious journals such as Current Biology or BBS, as well as books, including popular press books. Her research earned her wide recognition and several awards, such as York's President's Research Excellence Award, but she's also well known for her conservation efforts, in particular regarding orangutans. In 2018, I had an opportunity and the pleasure to meet Anne in person at a workshop organized in La Jolla by Michael. And I was impressed with her presentation. There is a difference of opinion between us on the topic of pantomime in apes, but it's only good for the discussion. And please remember that I have some theory, but Anne has the actual data. So without further ado, Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, so grade 8 pantomime. The issue was that it is apparently rare. And why it's rare? Well, frankly, I'm not so sure that it is rare, but let's go through it. What about it? Well, if it's rare, it's possible that it is rare only because it's rarely reported or studied. And I want to point out that I don't know if any of you ever followed the research on tactical deception. It was considered that tactical, that is voluntary deception, was not present in non-human primates, but in fact, no one had actually looked into it. And when a couple of researchers went and queried field experts who worked with non-human primates, they got a whole list of behaviors that qualify as deliberate voluntary deception. So one of the reasons that I think grade 8 pantomime looks rare is because basically nobody has looked at it all that much. Also, I think a big reason is that the research methods have been unsuitable. What researchers typically do is focus on a particular set of issues they wish to assess empirically. They go collect data specifically on those kinds of behaviors and don't record or just ignore other kinds of activities. So given the way that research methods are typically structured, if you're not actively going out and looking for pantomime, you might actually see it, but it's unlikely to be recorded. Also, it can unfold very slowly. So you get long duration reports, long duration events. One that I eventually identified took a whole day to unfold. Started first thing in the morning and it went on till late in the afternoon. I didn't know what in heaven's name was going on to start with. I was writing my notes about it, but I didn't figure out what was going until probably 3/4 of the way through the day. So it can be a very, especially with at least in orangutans anyway, things can unfold over a very long period of time. So it can be difficult to actually record and recognize what's happening. Also, social behavior in primates is very much based on individual recognition and individual roles in a particular and social structures. So if you don't have a lot of knowledge about the individuals that you're actually studying, you're probably unlikely to recognize why certain kinds of things are happening and how it is that they're actually unfolding. Like I say, if I didn't understand a lot of what I was seeing when I didn't recognize the individuals and the relationships that they had well enough. Also, in terms of sociality, you get different patterns depending on whether you're talking about wild individuals, captive individuals, or rehabilitants. As I say, I mostly studied rehabilitants. They have different relationship patterns, different social partner preferences and types of behavior. It also varies with age. So, example, infants behave very differently than juveniles or adolescents or adults. And newcomers coming into a group are going to behave very differently, or into a community. I shouldn't say group. Newcomers coming into a community are likely to have to deal with it differently than established residents. And I also think it's probably the case that pantomime is in fact rare within established relationships. Because if you've already got established relationships, you don't have to spell things out. I mean, if you think about a husband and wife cooking in the kitchen, the wife says, hey, would you give me the thing over there? You know, that thing I need to spin things around right now. So you don't have to actually name things. You have such an amount of shared information that you really have to make minimal gestures to actually, or comments to actually achieve the communication that you want. Okay, so what about orangutan? It's being rarely reported or studied. Well, partially their pantomime, it really is rare because of their type of sociality. It's very dispersed. They don't live in big groups. There are communities, but they're spread out very broadly, and that's largely because their habitat is very poor. So they can't afford to live in close proximity because there's just not enough food to go around if they try that. It's also supposedly rare because it's been assumed not to occur, just as I say, tactical deception was as well. People thought it didn't occur, so they didn't bother to look for it. It has rarely been targeted or included in research data collection, so it wouldn't be recorded, because if you don't have the right codes or the right way of expressing it, then you're not going to write it down. You're not going to report it appropriately. And say rarely recognized. One event I know of took a whole day to unfold, and I didn't recognize it until I looked back over the data that I had and finally figured out what had happened. And this will be particularly difficult if you're looking at wild orangutans, because wild orangutan sociality is very different from the kind of sociality that we're used to. So unless you understand their particular relationships and their particular interests, you're very likely to misunderstand what's going on. Okay, and yeah, messages rarely need acting out, the pantomime part, because the communication is mostly within relationships. So you have a lot of shared understanding and you don't actually have to spell out the whole thing. Okay, is it rare? I think it may be rare in wild orangutans. Pantomime may actually be rare in wild orangutans because they are so-called solitary, or they experience a very dispersed form of sociality. So they don't encounter each other very often, so they don't have to communicate very often. So it's just basically there isn't a whole lot of communication because they're on their own. Again, most communication is within established relationships. So as with humans, that means that you don't often have to spell out the whole story. You can get away with a few shorthand messages. And as an observer, I'd be unlikely to recognize what those mean because I don't get the shorthand version of what's going on. So basically, there are a few explicit communicative acts, so you just don't get a lot of spelled out stuff. So probably not that much pantomime. And yes, again, you rarely need to spell out the message. So one of the places that you are likely to find pantomimes happening is if you get a wrong or no response to something that you requested, or if there is some kind of violation of routines. So I think those would be the kinds of places where you might find pantomime rather than expecting it to be pretty common. In rehabilitants, the orangutans that I studied, they're wild-born individuals, almost 100%, captured as infants, as pets, or for the zoo trade, and then raised by humans, so they are humanized in their way of behaving. So they are human habituated, Means they're used to us, so it's basically easy to study them because they don't run away from you. But they're also often human enculturated, so that means they kind of speak human, so I'm more likely to understand what they do because they do things that humans make some sense out of. The ones that, the rehabilitants are ones who have been rescued from captivity and returned to forest life. Many of them are immatures. Being immatures, I think, also fosters or encourages pantomime-like behavior because they may need to communicate a lot as they try to figure out how life works. So you have the good thing as well, rich orangutan-human relationships, because these are little guys who need some support, and humans are in there typically monitoring them and supporting them as they return to their life in the forest. And of course, that means a lot of orangutan human communication. So you see a lot more than you probably would with wild orangutans. They are also, I tend to think of them as either bilingual or bicultural because they lived in the human world. So they know better how to speak to us, how to communicate to us, and we share more similar experiences. Research methods unsuitable for pantomime. Data, again, typically focused on specific study questions, predetermined, so there's not a lot of room for adding extra information on what you generate, on the code, on the data that you collect. And the methods are typically study specific, so pre-selected behavior types like feeding, vocalizing, nest building, and travel. So basically that's all that you record. And they're often time versus event sampled. So for example, you would make a recording every couple of minutes, and that really destroys or makes invisible or makes it very difficult to see patterns that occur over longer, or behavioral patterns that occur over longer time spans. It doesn't get the normal flow of behavior. It's chopped into little segments. And typically data recording has minimal narrative, so you get very little qualitative and contextual information. You just get the codes for the particular things that you're supposed to record. So of course that means, yeah, it's unlikely to suit representing pantomime, so it just doesn't get recorded. Hard to detect. It can unfold very slowly. And some of this I'm going to show you. One couple I know of were ruses created by orangutans to fool humans that played out over, in this case, 5 to 6 hours. The first one was a very nice adult female orangutan by the name of Princess, who spotted a place at the visitors' bunkhouse. They had volunteers that came and helped out with research at this site. So she was at their bunkhouse visiting with the humans that were there, and spotted a place where the window screen was slightly broken at the peak of one end at the peak of the roof, and she could break in there. She discovered it sometime in the middle of the day. It looked like she was actually leaving the humans behind, but she got up to the top of the roof, stopped there for a minute, and then came back down and resumed interacting with them. And from the time she resumed interacting with them, they were saying, well, she was always nice. They were saying how really, really nice she was on this particular day. It came to be 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the rehab project, offered food to the orangutans down at the dock, and she didn't go for food. Now, the first 3 priorities in orangutans' life are food, food, and food, but she didn't go for food that day. In fact, she stayed until it got dark, and everybody went into the bunkhouse to get cleaned up and get ready for dinner. They left the bunkhouse about 8 o'clock at night. She and her 1-year-old infant were sleeping over the front doorstep. So they had to very carefully step over her as they walked out to go off to dinner. But they locked the door and figured she was fine. Came back a couple of hours later. She was no longer there, neither was her infant. So they unlocked the door and tried to go in and discovered the door was locked from the inside. So somebody shined a flashlight in, and there was Princess and her infant inside. Asked her very nicely in Indonesian to open the door. So she came and opened the door and wandered out. When they went in to see what had happened, They went upstairs to an upper bedroom area up on the second floor and found the place trashed very neatly. She had opened up all of the suitcases that were there and took out and ate any bit of food that she found. And as the people were looking to see what had happened, they looked up at the peak of the roof at the far end of the house and discovered that the mesh screening that was up there was torn open, and that was probably how she got in. So she basically faked being really nice for 5 or 6 hours, successfully fooled a whole bunch of university educated humans so that she could break into the bunkhouse and get food. Another orangutan, very feisty, by the name of Unyok, similarly fooled a long-term Indonesian field assistant who'd known her for several years, so that she didn't quite succeed in this case, partly because I was videotaping, but she conned him into letting her get so close that she would be able to grab our backpacks that had food in them. Say she didn't quite make it because I spotted something funny while I was videotaping, but she again laid out a ruse that took several hours to unfold in order to get what she wanted. And it isn't just with humans that this happens. There was one I saw that took a whole day as a resident older male, an adolescent male, met a newcomer who had just arrived by the name of Aming. And over a whole day, what happened is Panjo kept trying to come and meet Aming, and he was very nice about it. He wasn't aggressive, but Aming was very scared, so Aming would always back away. I noticed, because this happened 15 or 20 times over several hours, that when Panjo came close, instead of trying to sniff Aming or touch him or do something like that, just as he got to the point where he could actually contact Aming, he'd turn away and eat something. I just thought it was odd at the time. I didn't make any sense of it until finally it got to the point that the two of them were on the ground 5 or 6 meters from each other. And Aming was very carefully watching Panjo because he was scared. And Panjo was about 5 meters away, acting as if he didn't even know Aming was present. Panjo was eating something, and Aming sat back, and eventually he started eating something as well. Finally, Panjo looked up, turned and saw Aming, and the expression was, "Oh my goodness, I didn't realize you were there." Started to approach, got close enough to contact Aming, again turned away and ate something. And what I finally figured out was that eating something for an orangutan in front of another orangutan, one orangutan eating something in front of another orangutan is a message of friendly intent, because food is a big priority in orangutan's life, the first priority. So basically, if you're eating, then you are not going to be doing anything bad. So in this case, Panjo multiple times performed the fake eating. It wasn't even real eating, it fake eating, as a message to Aming. Aming didn't get it until then finally did, and then he did start to accept contact. Once I recognized that pattern, I saw the same thing happening when a larger dominant orangutan met a smaller orangutan. In several cases, the smaller orangutan was trying to get out of the way from the older one, but immediately, that as soon as the older one started to eat something, fake or not, and I think it was in a lot of cases fake, the scared one would come and approach and be much more willing to interact. So whole day here. Yeah. One of the things that made it easier for me to deal with is that rehabilitants do it more than wild orangutans. I think wild orangutans don't do it a whole lot, or I'm just not recognizing it. But it certainly appears to be the case that rehabilitants enact pantomime more than wild ones do. First of all, they're human habituated and human enculturated, so there are a fair number of interactions, and they probably have to spell out what they want to humans more than they do to other orangutans. They also share more of the world with human rehabilitants, share more of the world with humans than wild ones do. So their communication is probably richer. and they're probably more able to, as I say, being bilingual. They know enough to speak human, so they know what kinds of things to do to communicate effectively with humans. So acting out things, they're more likely to do with humans because they have to spell the stuff out to humans. They've been less studied than wild orangutans, so that probably accounts for the fact that until I got my act together, there wasn't a lot of information on their communication. So how to detect it? Studying rehabilitants again, and again, probably easier to detect it because they're doing they live in humanized living contexts and human activities. They're also human habituated and often human enculturated, and also a lot of them are immatures, and much easier to deal with an immature orangutan than an adult. They're more social than the adult ones, and they also don't bite as bad. Given the rich relationships, that means there is rich orangutan human communication. So you get a lot of communication with humans. And again, they often have to spell it out for humans more than they do with other orangutans. Okay. Also, one thing that I always did was, as I call, rich data collection. I didn't use the standard just coded behavior system that most researchers use. Still the standard full day follows, nest to net follows, but rich data collection. Also, all of our observers were familiar with the orangutans being studied. So that meant that we had pre-existing or had developed considerable knowledge with respect to what their normal behavior patterns were like, their normal social relationships, for example, who they were friends with and who they weren't friends with, and their competencies, what they were able to do and what they weren't able to do. So that helped also to clarify or record accurately and record enough information to characterize what they were doing. Also narrative data collection rather than the codes, and a fair amount of video. One of the good things about video is that you can review an event and correct the description, because you often miss things when they're happening live. It takes some more permanent information before you can detect all the little things that you missed when you were actually present. Okay. We also tended to report entire events, okay, and also sometimes pre and post event information. So reports could easily include more information about an event than just the event itself. If you knew something about what had happened 15 minutes before, for example, you might add it if it appeared to be relevant for what was going on. So just a lot of narrative went into our data collection that a lot of researchers don't typically use. Also, I think I finally recognized when you needed pantomime, and that is if there is some violation in a normal routine where you get no or the wrong response to some kind of behavior, that's the kind of thing that would get an orangutan to basically explain what they wanted by pantomime. Okay, so for example, Rocky with his hair. Okay, I should have a video. Yeah, there should be a video. Here we are. Oh, it can't play it. All right, sorry about that. I may not be able to play the other one as well. Rocky is a captive orangutan at Indianapolis Zoo. I'll just explain what happened. There was a young woman who worked at the zoo who used to come and visit him at his enclosure periodically. He really liked her a lot. And I think part of the reason he liked her a lot is he had very red orangutan colored hair. And she was a nice female, he was an adolescent male. What she would often do when she came to visit him, or what she did on some video that they recorded one day, was she took the elastic out of her hair and then fixed her hair, pulled it back and put it into a ponytail to tidy it up. Rocky watched her very intently and made similar kinds of twisting actions with his hand, basically imitating what she was doing. they sent it to me and they said they had pantomime. And they said, no, you have imitation. He copied what she did. If it's a communicative thing, I suggest you do is have her come back tomorrow, film it too, and tell her not to do her hair and see if Rocky will ask her to do it. So she went back to the next day, went to the same place, sat there. Rocky came over towards her and sat down, waited a respectable half a minute or so. She didn't do her hair. So then what he did is he took his hands, pulled up the top of the hair on his old head, and he twisted it in ways that she did. So he used what he had done the day before. He imitated, but he used it as a pantomime to ask her to do her hair. When she started to do her hair the way she had, he stopped. So it was clear that his own actions were not because he wanted to do his own hair, but he was asking her via pantomime to do it himself. City and the Coconut, say this, I guess I can't play this one either. Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah, I don't know why, it's a large file, that's probably why. In this case, City was about 6. She was eating, background was she was eating one of the native coconuts that grow in the area. It's a different coconut than the one we have. It still has nice coconut milk and coconut flesh inside, but these coconuts have 3 little eyes with 3 little small cells under the eye. So there's just a little bit of gelatinous sort of food that they like. So she had a coconut and had a stick. She had a stick that she was using to break into one of the 3 eyes of the coconut and got it open just fine and dandy, and got the little bit of coconut cream that was in there and ate it. So she was clearly quite capable of doing it. There were 2 more eyes to go, but instead of doing the 2 more eyes, opening the 2 more eyes to get what was in there, she picked up the coconut and walked over to sit beside the Orangutan Project field assistant who was monitoring her that day. And what she did is she handed him the coconut. Because I could see other things that were going on, I could see that there were old dried up coconuts that had been split in half as if cut by a machete. This was not torn apart by hand or chewed open. This was cut with a knife. So I figured out that probably in the past, it was a little inference about history, that some of the field assistants that were monitoring the orangutans were opening coconuts for them. So I say what she did when she walked over to the guy with her unchopped open coconut and handed it to him, it was an implicit request for him to chop the coconut open. Now, I happened to be videotaping and the assistants are not supposed to do it. So the guy sat there frozen, like he didn't know what to do. So City sat there for a minute. And when he didn't do it, she picked up a stick. It was actually a chopped off piece of the coconut palm, just a stick. She took it and she thwacked at the coconut the way you would if you were going to chop it open with a machete. So at that point, I said to the guy, "Oh, come on, open up her coconut for her. She's asking you to do it." So he did then take his machete, take her coconut, whack it open. And as he did, she sat there very quietly, watched him, was very happy about it, appeared very, agreeable to it. And when he was done, took her half of the coconut and ate it. So in this case, what she did is she acted out the chopping open the coconut because he didn't do the thing that he normally did. In this case, the point again was that the history is important. The reason I knew that this guy must be chopping open coconuts, or a lot of the assistants did, was because of the chopped open coconut on the ground. So I was able to piece together a notion that there had these kinds of things had been happening previously. And that was why she ended up doing her pantomime. She was not getting what she normally got. and then she acted it out in order to explain. The last one, I think I already told you the story of Panjul meeting Aming. Panjul being the resident older male at the time, and Aming being the newcomer. This one, hard to get, again, because of the long duration. It went on for a whole day. And if I hadn't been following the two of them for the whole day and seeing basically the entire unfolding of the eating in front of somebody as a message of friendly intent, I would never have figured out what was going on. So I think the particular methods that you use in collecting data are very important in terms of, or at least in my case, were very important in terms of being able to identify in a pantomime. Because if I had used standard methods, I would never have figured it out. Oh, there we are. Yeah. So where do we go from that? So does spontaneous pantomime occur in orangutans? Well, yes, it does. Is it rare? Maybe, but I wouldn't be so quick to decide that that is necessarily the case. It may be rare because there is so much shared understanding in their normal relationships. They don't have to do it that often. On the other hand, there are newcomers that come into a community. So in those cases, it may in fact be very important to be communicating using something like pantomime to make more clear what the messages are. Is it cognitively complex? I don't think it necessarily is, because in humans, there are studies showing that human infants, about 2-year-olds, can do it. And I recall a case seeing of one infant about 18 months old doing something that could possibly qualify as a very primitive pantomime. Chimpanzees. I don't know if any of you ever knew of Vicky, a chimpanzee who was raised by humans in the 1950s. The point was to see how much basically human enculturation could change their intelligence and how they behave. When she was about 1.5 years old, Vicky apparently had an imaginary routine, a pretend routine that she did. She pretended that she was dragging, she had a pull toy that she dragged around, but she also had a pretend pull toy that she pretended to drag around. She would apparently wander around the room pulling this non-existent pull toy. One day, she pulled her non-existent pull toy into the bathroom when Mrs. Hayes was there, and started to pull her invisible pull toy around the bathroom toilet. She got it partway around, apparently, and then she tugged as though it was stuck and couldn't make it happen. So she tugged and tugged and it wouldn't work. So then she looked at Mrs. Hayes and cried to Mrs. Hayes about her pull toy. Mrs. Hayes says, I don't know what I thought I was doing, but it felt really crazy. But she pretend released the caught pull toy, gave the imaginary pull toy cord back to Vicky, and then Vicky wandered off with her pulling her imaginary pull toy again, and apparently looked at Mrs. Hayes with great thanks for having loosened her pull toy for her. So there was a whole imaginary event that went on that Vicky concocted that involved acting out a stuck pull toy and then getting it loose and taking it and walking again. Gorillas, there are some reports, if you check some of the records, especially on Coco, some of the records of what she did look as though they would qualify as pantomime. Orangutans, the ones I know of, again, by the time they're 2 or 3 years old, they appear to be able to do it. And baboons, there are several cases of tactical deception, papers by Byrne and Whiten back in the 1980s when people claimed that deception was something that non-humans don't do. If you go through their records, there are some cases of baboons, both adults and immatures that sound a lot like pantomime. In one case, for example, there were 2 juvenile baboons sitting near each other in a piece of forest, grouped nearby. One of the baboons had a particular piece of food and was eating it. The other immature baboon wanted it. So the baboon that wanted it apparently cried out to the adults, acting as though the baboon, the immature that had the food, had done something terrible, had stolen the food from him. So the adults all came and attacked the poor baboon who had been just eating something left the food, and when the chase was over, the immature who wanted the food and wanted to steal it then grabbed the food and ate it. So it happens in individuals who are much less sophisticated cognitively than adult humans are. So it's not as rare as you might expect in other species, and it certainly occurs in orangutans. Oh, and again, of course, we now recognize that great apes' cognitive ceiling is about at the level of a 4-year-old human child. That's from evidence on the false belief test that they didn't pass for a long time, but now it's known that they do. So cognitively, they appear to have the capacities that are certainly sophisticated enough for pantomime. So that's it.
Okay. Thank you very much. And are there any questions?
I have a question for you, Anne.
Sure.
Can you define pantomime? I know we're going to talk about that in our so some of the examples you gave, the reason I ask is some of the examples you gave are really clear to me that I would call that pantomime. The example of breaking into the top level, the ruse, breaking into the window. I missed what was pantomimic about that one.
The orangutan came back and was acting really, really nice to the humans on the porch. She was always nice, but she was more nice. It was like the little chimpanzee.
So play acting, assuming a role I see.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very broad, I mean, no criticism intended. I'm just saying that's a very broad definition, probably not one that I would use in my work, but okay. Thanks for clarifying. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if that's certainly understandable that you may want to take more or less, but I think what I did is try to take anything that could possibly fit into that category. So you can see the kinds of things that happen. If you don't want to include it, fine and dandy, but it certainly does give you an idea of the kinds of things that happen spontaneously that great apes do, but mostly great apes, but again, other species do it as well, that are certainly in the ballpark. They're certainly voluntarily acting out things that are not what they really want to do in order to communicate and express a particular message to somebody else. So basically, a lot of the time, they're lying. So if you like, lies in some cases, but that lies created by acting things out.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
I am wondering, thank you for that very interesting talk. I really want to see the videos. I'm wondering if you just go out of your slide presentation, would you be able to show them to us, not embedded in your presentation?
So as a suggestion, because we'll have the panel in about an hour, a little bit more than an hour, maybe it will be possible to somehow share them for the panel. And also Michael says that he has the second example, no, the first example, right? The hair example, yeah. So that will be available.
Thank you again, Anne. That was great. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I think you have shown pantomime in orangs very convincingly, but perhaps it's not pantomime in the sense that we have in language origins, where it's a path towards a systematic form of communication. Even if it's not rare, it's pretty unusual, and it seems to be isolated performances that are never going to be repeated. And they seem to, the examples you've given tend to be in the case of human interaction having a decisive influence. In your recordings in the wild, have you ever seen pantomimes that occur without any human influence in your sense of pantomime? And have you ever seen those, in some sense, catch on so that they're used more than once? Before you answer, I just want to add one more observation. As you know, there have been some observations, which not everyone believes, of ontogenetic ritualization in apes, chimpanzees, where a couple will develop a gesture which ritualizes a particular performance by one member of the pair. So in that case, it stays used for that one pair. It only goes in one direction. A does it for B, not B doing it for A, but it is repeated again and again. And so to tie that back, one might not even ask for pantomime to yield gestures or such that are used by different orangutans, but even repeated performance of a pantomime in the wild as a way of requesting something of another particular orangutan.
Used commonly, say the fake eating is one of those. That's the one condition, or the one that comes to mind most clearly as very much an orangutan thing. If you're and it's fake eating, that say they do it not really eating something, but you pretend to eat, and it immediately calms down a partner, a conspecific, another orangutan. It calmed me down too. Immediately calmed down another orangutan who was being fearful. It happened in a number of situations. As say, there was the long one that I told you about with Panjoling Aming. Once I figured that out, I found that I saw it relatively often, or I recalled other circumstances where the same thing happened. So it's a simple thing to do, but it's it's not real because it's fake. It's doing it for the communication, because they'll often fake eat things that they don't normally eat. So this is for communication purposes, not a real functional action. So what were the, remind me of your other questions?
I think that really was the key question, of whether there was any evidence in the wild of repeated use of a pantomime performance for communication, as distinct from these anecdotally fascinating isolated performances that showed, if you will, pantomimic intention, but never became part of a shared system. And that raises the question of perhaps you're seeing within the ape spectrum seeds of pantomime in the way that we're thinking about it in the path to language, but lacking that ability to spread. And then I used ontogenetic ritualization as an example of what also might not be on the path to communication with parity in any sense, but was interesting in the sense of a ritualized performance that could be used again and again.
One of the things that might be worth looking into, I haven't for a while, but there have been some major efforts in the orangutan world to compile material from all kinds of different sites to figure out patterns. And certainly a very important venture a couple of decades ago now was orangutan cultures, which speak directly to the issue of acquired, not standard behavior, but behaviors that are specific to a particular community. And if you're talking cultures, you're talking about the social world, so there would certainly be communication in there. So the cultures material might be a place to go to see what there is by way of different communicative patterns that appear, or that are used in different groups.
Okay, we also have some questions on Zoom from Monika Bruta-Żywiczyńska and Stephen Brown, and I hope Monika will forgive me. I will read Stephen's question first because it follows up on what was just said. Stephen writes, I wonder if pretense is a general concept for the examples you're talking about. Pantomime can be thought of as a form of pretense in that it is not an actual action, but instead a pretend version of one. This would combine playing nice, in quotation marks, with the mimed actions.
Yeah, certainly a relationship, but there's been a fair amount of research on pretense in primates as well. A couple of volumes, actually, that was back about the 1990s as well. I could probably dig out that material if you were interested in it.
Okay, and a question from Monika. Monika writes, wonderful stories. Many thanks for the presentation. We can never ignore such important insights from non-human ape behavior when we think of pantomime. I share your belief that we need to understand ape cultures to be able to decode their behaviors rather than base our intuitions on what we humans do. I wanted to ask about how you decode requests. You mentioned when an ape stops their behavior after someone performs an action, her example, what are some other markers of requests? I immediately thought of gaze patterns. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose gaze patterns. I wouldn't be orangutans, but I know in baboons, a travel direction. What baboons do when they're starting travel, and I think maybe bonobos do it as well, is an individual will bid for a travel direction. What they do is they walk a few meters, they walk away in the direction that they would like to travel, they would like the group to travel, and then stop and wait to see whether they're followed or not. So you may have several individuals that are bidding for which way we're going to go, by acting out which way they're intending to go towards. So yeah, it could be an important social thing to see. That's the only one that comes to mind right off the top of my head, but closest I can get.
Are there any other questions? Okay, there is one more. Do you have that?
Thank you very much. I also look forward to seeing these amazing videos. And maybe because I haven't seen them, I may sound a bit skeptical. Because maybe it was your claim towards the end that pantomime is not cognitively complex, because for several of us, pantomime is, per definition, cognitively complex, because pantomime presupposes sign use. And sign use presupposes that the subject understands the representational relationship between the gesture and its meaning. And if the performance in question can be explained with simpler mechanisms such as ontogenetic ritualization, or the rocky hair, that I think could be explained in terms of Piagetian imitation and maybe even deferred imitation, but again, not in terms of representation, not in terms of what Piaget called a semiotic function, which for Piaget, he thought this is uniquely human and it comes towards the end of the second year of life. So I'm wondering, could it be that again we're having slightly different notions of pantomime? One kind of more lean notion, and another richer.
Possible. I mean, most phenomena have richer and richer and more restricted definitions. So yeah, I think I gave you a version of what the definition was that I was operating on. So yeah, so certainly, yeah, you cut it in different ways, no problem with that. Yeah. Imitation with the hair being, the hair thing being imitation. Yeah, it was, but it was imitation used in order to communicate. I mean, that's the point. It's how you use it. It's not the form that it takes. It's how you're using it. A lot of it will be imitation in the sense that you are possibly enacting something that you saw. For example, Siti, who wanted the guy to chop open the coconut, she imitated what he had done, but it was being used for communicative purposes. It wasn't for her to just see if she could do it. She was doing it for communication. So that would be the how I would see the two as fitting together.
Intention. Do like this is the meaning.
In that case, but there are other cases where I saw them, forget if I mentioned this, doing an action, but doing a pantomime, but towards themselves. It's like they were trying to figure out how this worked. Did you do it like this? Well, how did you do that there? So it wasn't directed at someone else. It was directed to how did this work?
Thanks a lot. That was really cool. I was thinking some more about the pretend play, pretense relationship, and pantomime being a form of pretense. And here I was thinking, when you say like pantomime isn't cognitively complex, the thing is that in like pretense for children actually is quite complex, because even if they do pantomime or if they reenact something in pretend play, they need an object that they have. So the classical thing is like pretend to brush your teeth, and children first need some object that they can use to pretend to brush their teeth. Then around 3 years they can use their finger, and only when they're about 4 years to 5 years of age can they brush their teeth with an invisible toothbrush. So there is a clear kind of movement away from kind of a physical manifestation that they use for their pretense and arguably their pantomime. And so I was wondering to what degree objects are involved in like great ape pantomime. And
by cognitively I don't think I meant the same thing that you meant by cognitively complex. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought here. Ask the question part again. I got lost. So.
The question part was pretense and pantomime seem to be kind of complex in children because they need like a material anchor for much of their pretense and their pantomime, and kind of without a material anchor comes later. And what's it like in great apes? And does that mean maybe there is a difference between like the way children do it and the way other great apes do it?
Yeah. I think it's age dependent, yeah. Given that great apes can achieve some similar levels of cognitive complexity to some degree. If they're doing the same thing that you see kids doing, they may be using very similar cognitive processes. In some other situations, that will not be the case. So it just depends on the particular activities and how well they fit into the range of things that great apes are capable of doing. So and things that can be handled in solutions that can be generated at multiple cognitive levels, of course, end up making complications because it can be difficult to figure out what exactly maybe you can't figure out what the cognitive processes were that underlie it. A lot of things can be learned by rote rather than by understanding. So trying to determine whether they're cognitively sophisticated or not it's not necessarily easy, and so things with the same behaviors are not necessarily comparable with respect to the processes involved.
Okay, thank you.
Time for one more question. And if there is no such question, then I will take the liberty to ask it. So I would agree actually that pantomime is not that cognitively complex, or alternatively, we can say that perhaps pantomime is cognitively complex, but great apes are easily at the level of cognitive complexity that pantomime, I suppose, is easily available to them. And the reason that pantomime is rare is, I believe, a little bit different, but that's a different story. I wanted to comment on the distinction between pretend eating and the hair example, because they are different in a very interesting way that falls on the ostensive communication explanation. Because the first instance, the pretend eating, if I understand it correctly, would not be kind of communicative. It would be pretend instrumental action. and the initiator kind of there is some informative intention, as it's called, but there is no communicative intention. So it's not like intended direct communication. But the hare example is different, right? In the hare example, the ape wants the recipient of the communication to understand its communicative intention.
Okay. On the fake eat, I disagree that the first one was not intentional. In all of the cases that I saw, I never saw a very first case of somebody fake eating. All of the ones I saw were in individuals between individuals that would have known each other for substantial periods of time or had been with other orangutans. So I would have no idea how it started in the first place and what it was used for. But in all the cases that I knew and that I saw, it appeared to be very much a pretend thing to do. They were using it for communicative purposes. They were not actually eating because they wanted to eat for some reason or other.
Okay. Yes, I actually wanted to thank you once again for the presentation.